Hello, strangers. But it's funny, because you look kind of familiar. And this is story number 31.
My family was never what you'd call wealthy, but we were comfortable due to a lot of good habits: saving, budgeting, coupon clipping. My grandma, who has since passed and is missed, grew up in the Great Depression, so I think the emphasis on saving really came from her. For those not aware of the residual impacts of that event, a giant economic depression caused by a stock market crash that left people worldwide struggling for food and shelter. Well, it leaves its echoes in odd practices and habits. One was a fervor for saving. Another we discovered after Grandma had passed away and we were left with the job of packing up all of her earthly possessions. Scattered throughout the house and concealed under beds, on top shelves, and even in a couple of coat pockets were cans of food. By God, Grandma had decided she would never go hungry like that again. But Grandma was also a generous woman. In one surprise and amazing gesture, she paid for our whole family, her 2 kids, and their families, to travel with her to Aruba. We ended up renting a villa to hold us all. It was a 5-room bungalow, but when we arrived, it was only 4 bedrooms, 1 living room. There was a lot of consternation, but it was too late to change any of the details of the lodging. Not wanting it to be a huge fuss, my cousin and I volunteered to sleep in the living room, leaving 1 room for Grandma, 1 room for my parents, 1 room for my cousin's parents, and 1 room for the boys. After all, Grandma had been so kind as to pay for this trip. It was the least we could do to solve a problem like this. The first few nights were okay, even though my cousin and I were now at the mercy of whoever decided to wake up first in the house. But one night, our parents had had a little too much to drink. They'd propped and left open a skylight right above the couch my cousin and I shared. And of course, it rained that night, a big tropical thunderstorm. My cousin and I were drenched awake, scurrying half blind from deep sleep to find the hook pole to close it. Thankfully, it was just water, and not difficult to clean up. But running about in wet clothes as I did led to one of the worst illnesses I've ever had. It descended upon me just as quickly as the storm had. By 9 the next day, my mom had taken me to a clinic. We'd gotten some antibiotics and fever pain reducers prescribed. Unbeknownst to us, the fever/pain medicine took the pain reduction a little more seriously than we were used to. It had codeine, a fairly serious narcotic. While it relieved the rattling cough I had developed, it also made my vision tilt and my mind feel very foggy. That same day, the whole family had planned to go snorkeling out by the beach. I clearly couldn't go, but I urged my family to go on ahead. How often were they going to see Aruba? With great reluctance, off they set, leaving me dozing on the couch. I was barely awake enough to hear the door keypad engage its lock. A word about the villa in which we were staying. It was beautiful, if a bit smaller than advertised. It was one of a cluster of rental villas on a hillside overlooking their famous white sand beaches. While the villas were walled in from the street outside the cluster with a fairly thick and tall wall, there were no walls separating one villa from another. Ours even had a shared palapa, or tiki hut, with a neighboring villa. We'd come in the off-season of September, so as far as we could tell, the other villas were unoccupied. But after what happened that day, we suspect that one of them might not have been as empty as it appeared. Seemingly seconds after my parents left, I was roused from my hazy sleep by what sounded like an off-key little jingle. I thought about it and realized it was the little door keypad's bright little tones. I cracked open my eyes, but saw that the front door was closed. I dreamt it then. I laid back down, letting the hollow clacking of the bamboo wind chimes outside sort of lull me back to sleep. But they were loud. At first I just assumed it was a gust of wind making them bang together so loudly, and thinking another flash-in-the-pan tropical rain shower may be coming. I rose to go find the pole with which the skylight could be closed, just in case. But as I did, slowly stumbling around the room, I happened to look out the patio door at the palapa and superfluous pool. It looked so clear and nice that I ended up wandering over to it, raising a hand to steady myself on the glass patio door. I nearly fell face first through the doorway and onto the patio. That's why the wind chimes had seemed so loud. The sliding glass door was open. I closed it, paused, then hit the little keypad lock button. But my head was so muzzy, it didn't occur to me that I should be alarmed. I stumbled back to the couch, laid down, hook pole to close the skylight completely forgotten. The tiny trip to the patio had worn me out. I dozed off again. I found myself in a dream. In my dream, the rattling cough had subsided. While I was still on the couch, I felt like I was sort of floating above it. I had no feeling of weight or pressure on any of my limbs. Was I floating up to the skylight? Oh no, I thought. If I floated through the skylight, weightless as a balloon, I'd disappear, swallowed into the jewel blue sky. I tried to call someone to pull me down, back to the couch, even as my eyes seemed locked on the skylight, warmth on my face from a sun that was no longer overhead, but slid off to the side of the window, out of view. But I was deep in my dreams. My voice felt locked, mewling and weak. The dream tossed me a bone, though. From the back of the couch, a long white arm, stiff as a mannequin's, slowly grew. The fingers slowly unfurled as it lowered and came to rest high on my chest, near my collarbone. In my dream, I was relieved. I wasn't floating off to get lost in the sky today. Then, the little off-key tune sounded again, followed by the sound of the front door. Still in my dream, I had no idea what was going on. From my tilted perspective, there was a thunder of voices, the sense of rapid movement around me. The arm that had sprung from the couch to hold me in place was suddenly gone, leaving a warmth there where it had laid on my chest. It cooled rapidly. A slamming of the sliding glass door being yanked open, and suddenly I was in my dad's strong arms, my mother's voice a jagged saw cutting me from my dream. Police were called. As the codeine wore off and I woke up more and more, I started to understand why the cops were there, what their questions were about. I looked into my mom's bright eyes, dawning horror reflecting from hers to mine, and I was sobered by the fear I saw there. For while I was drugged, I hadn't imagined the jingle. The patio door had not been left open accidentally, and the couch hadn't grown arms. Someone, a man only my dad had gotten a good look at, had known and entered the key code to the patio door. He had simply slid the door open and walked in. The pillow and assortment of food wrappers behind the couch suggested he'd slid around my stumbling self, sat down just out of my vision, and had been there right behind me, close enough to reach out and touch me, which, once full from his meal of stolen bread and crackers from the wrappers he left behind, he had. We were on high alert, jumpy, for the next couple of days. When I mentioned to the police that he'd known the passcode to the door, else he wouldn't have been able to enter, I hoped this would narrow down their search. We left the island 2 days later. We never did hear if they found the guy, or even reset the key code. I know I was extremely lucky that his attention seemed to be primarily focused on food. If he'd broken in with other motives having to do with an unconscious 12-year-old, then this story may have had a much different ending. It's something I try not to think about when I'm alone, drifting off to sleep. But the mind plays tricks, and sometimes, in the moments before I fall asleep, I swear, I can see that white arm growing, reaching out in my peripheral vision, and I can hear a little off-tune jingle of a door keypad.
Well, well, well. Another bonus story that you've unlocked. Sit tight. This is story 133.
It was truly the flight from hell. When I boarded the jet to go home after a long work trip, it was already warm. I'm a frequent flyer though, and I understood that as soon as the plane was buttoned up and we were on our way, the cooling would be more concentrated and the cabin would cool down. Surprise, the delay was due to the air conditioning not working. It was over an hour before they even let us off the plane to air out. Delay after delay, customer service lines after each hop, rebooked flight. At the same time, those of us who had been separated from our checked luggage had a concern beyond connecting flights. See, often, airlines will put multi-layover flight checked luggage through to the final destination when they can to save room for the inevitable folks who show up with coffin-sized bags they hope to slip through as carry-ons. Sure enough, by the time I'd made it to my second connection, my bag had already racked up quite a few air miles. It was, in the words of the customer service clerk, slingshotting across the states as it was pulled from a jet's belly, then sent on another flight, attempting to hone in on where it could meet me. And me. At that point, I'd missed any potential flight that could get me to my destination that day. I was resigned to having to overnight it in a hotel close to the airport, likely one close enough to hear all the flights I wasn't taking off on. I was hot, cranky, and hangry. My limit on buying the overpriced airline food had been reached, both in total cost and how much of the odd metal aftertaste I was willing to eat. I was exhausted, and as I deboarded the plane at Newark, now hoping that one thing would go right, that my bag full of all the things I needed to approximate a human, contact lens and toothbrush stuff, clothes and such, would be there. And that little bit of luck was with me. My bag had somehow made it to Newark on a completely different flight. Myself and a few others in my position were directed across the airport to the held baggage office to collect our things before catching a shuttle to the hotel the airline had put us up in overnight. Fresh tickets to the next morning's flights in our hands. I tried to keep that in mind as I joined the line outside the baggage office. It was 9 p.m., and I did the math backwards to see how many, or few, hours of sleep I could manage, depending on when the shuttle actually got me to the hotel. I probably looked like hell, so when I was tapped on the shoulder by someone behind me, I assumed my grim face and less than daisy-fresh appearance would nip any attempts at small talk in the bud. Well, that little bit of luck couldn't hold out forever. The hand that had tapped me belonged to a man. When I'd turned, I had near jumped back. He was very close to me in line, so close that we could have exchanged a kiss. He was dressed in a white shirt and brown slacks, average height, but extremely pale, so pale that his skin looked almost translucent. Even with my bleary eyes, I could see the road map of blue veins faintly at his temples. He was wearing those transition lenses in his glasses. Standing as we were in a dim part of the airport, I could barely tell where his eyes were looking. It was like a tea bag at the bottom of a glass teacup, swimming obscured in brown. He smiled, revealing rows of even, small teeth. Doll teeth, I thought. He spoke in a tenor. I had a headache. His questions began simply. Someday, right? I scoffed, gave a sort of smile, acknowledging, but not adding to it. He then asked where I was going. I began to say, then stopped. Some latent instinct, or lesson for girls traveling alone, locked my tongue. I began to say, then stopped. Some latent instinct, or lesson for girls traveling alone, locked my tongue. I shrugged, said, only a little farther. I kept it short, hoping he would get bored, maybe ask somebody else. But his questions continued. Business or pleasure, he asked. I shrugged, saying, neither really. I turned back around, only for him to tap me again. I turned, and he was still smiling at me. He continued with his questions. Did I travel often? I shrugged again, said sure, began to turn, but stopped when I saw his too pale starfish hand at once rise to tap me a third time. Stood as I was, side to him, trying to make my expression as put upon, bored, and unattractive as possible. I stared at him. I was near shocked. It was clear I didn't want to speak to him, and he was getting off on it. He grinned widely. He asked if I'd ever been to this airport before. I stared. My lack of response didn't seem to bother him at all. He asked had I ever had so many delays. I didn't respond. Something was tickling me in a very unpleasant way in what little remained of my awake brain. Cold, squelchy, like the random globs of wet food you sometimes find when washing dishes. What was this guy's deal? He was creepy. Right on cue, his next question. Had the airline put me up at the same hotel he was going to? I didn't respond again, both because this seemed obvious to me. The airline wasn't going to expend the effort to suddenly book lush travel agent-style accommodations for each passenger. They couldn't even keep their budget planes in working order. But also, I did not like that he was highlighting he knew where I'd be going after this. After the public of the airport, the much more secluded and private hotel. Right on cue, as if he sensed how uncomfortable I was becoming, as if that had been his goal from the start. He giggled. Not chuckled. Not laughed. His voice was higher pitched than that. He giggled. And then he asked, was I traveling the whole way, alone? I took half a step back. I began to open my mouth, to finally say something. Surely that was the line, that was rude, I could respond. But behind me, the voice of the attendant called my name to enter her office and retrieve my bag. I lunged away, putting as much distance as I could between us to collect my nondescript black roller bag. I dashed outside to the shuttle waiting area. The air wasn't clean. It reeked of jet fuel and tire rubber. But it was cold, and I breathed it in deep. I felt better with the distance, and my already jangled nerves began to settle as the shuttle arrived. I got aboard, slid my bag into the racks, and took a seat in the back. I almost felt normal again. I did, until right before the shuttle closed its doors to take me and the few other airline refugees to the hotel. A fish-white hand emerged at the door, shoving forward another black roller suitcase. Of course, it was him. I saw him shove his bag in and then look around. I'd taken a seat next to someone else, and it was at the back of the bus. There was no means for him to sit next to or behind me, at least. But that didn't seem to be his plan. I watched as he sat, instead, next to the door, his back to the windowed side, and kept his eyes, his murky eyes, the movement only faintly detectable as they swam behind those muddied lenses, trained on me. And that smile, those filed to same size little teeth, shone wetly in the passing lights of the street lights outside. We got to the hotel. I sprang forward and grabbed my bag from the rack, dashing off to be first in line to get my room. Others were equally as invested in getting off the bus. When I chanced to look behind me, I was relieved. He was only just then sauntering up to the back of the line as I was handed my keycard. I smiled, thanked the desk attendant with the overflow warmth I felt at the relief at the final good luck of getting away from the guy, and I booked it to the elevator. Normally, I wouldn't be the one to slam the closed doors button, but I sure was that night. I made it to my room, slipped inside, and used every lock I could to secure the door. I stood there, almost like I was waiting, expecting him to come down the hall at any second. Must have been minutes I stood there, watching through the fisheye peephole, but no one from the group seemed to be on my floor. I saw no one at all. I relaxed, used the restroom, grabbed my phone, updated my friends on what was now being referred to as the trip from hell. Then I pulled my suitcase over to the bed. I wanted to grab my contact lens kit out before my eyes decided to stick to the lenses. I zipped it open and flipped up the top, but then stopped cold. It wasn't my suitcase. I mean, it was the same brand. It had the same liner and pockets, but the things inside, they weren't mine. The shirt on top, a white button down, wasn't mine. There was a book tucked in the top where I put my toiletries in my bag. Disbelieving, I moved the shirt, discovering a pair of brown slacks. No. I shoved those aside too. Beneath them was a ramble of toiletries, a comb missing some teeth, a toothbrush that looked like it had been gnawed on by rats, a belt, actually a few belts, a lot of belts. I pulled one out. It wasn't a belt at all. Leather, metal buckle, but this one was short and had a U-ring on it. The closest I can describe it to is those ankle cuff attachments they have at the gym for cable machines. I looked at it, puzzled. What on earth? I stopped, not knowing how to feel. Knowing without knowing that this bag was that creepy man's bag, splayed open, indecent on my bed. I felt so sick, so sour. And why was he traveling with leather restraints? Beneath these, I believe I saw the gloss of a magazine cover. The font was in red. And beneath it, a woman's face, her mouth and eyes open wide. At once I wanted to pull it out, but I also wanted to slam the bag shut and toss the whole thing away from me. And suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I jumped. If I hadn't already used the bathroom, I'd have pissed myself. I whirled about, stared at the door. I never saw a hotel door look so foreboding. I forced myself to approach, and like I was leaning in to taste a dish I hated, I bent at the hips to press my eye to the peephole, too certain that I would see a row of smiling, too small teeth. And through the peephole, I saw a hotel staff worker, an obviously tired one, a blonde kid in a rumpled dress shirt with a little silver name tag all askew. He had to knock again before I could move, step back and open the door. He grinned, apologized, said there'd been a mix-up. Did I have a bag that wasn't mine? And at his side, my bag. I nodded, turned, raced back to my bed, stuffed the clothes back in, back to the door at record time to exchange the suitcases. It took everything in me to hand it instead of shoving it away from me. All at once his bag in my hands felt slimy, sandy, somehow. He smiled, said thanks and again sorry for the trouble, and turned to leave, sidestepping something as he did. And as the door closed between us, I heard it. Quietly, a high-pitched giggle. The man had been standing off to the side of the door, out of my eyesight, which meant the man now knew which room I was in. I headed down to the lobby, asked for a shuttle back to the airport, and stayed overnight there. I held my breath as I stood in the boarding area, but he never appeared. He wasn't on my flight. Hadn't been on any of my previous flights either, so I guess that made a kind of sense. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't cautious, paranoid glances all over, the rest of the trip home.
I'm not such a big fan of business travel myself. I did plenty of it in my military days, I guess. Anymore, I'm just a homebody. And I must admit, stories like this, they're not going to change that for me anytime soon. If you'd like to reach out, email and socials are in the description. Interacting with the like, comment, and subscribe features does something, allegedly. And otherwise, we'll meet again next Tuesday. Stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.